Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Aliens After Dark. Every night on this channel, I share alien and UFO encounter stories, told softly to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, get comfortable, let your eyes close if they want to, and let's begin. Every car in that lot was facing out. That is where I start now, on the rare occasion I tell it. Not the sound, not the thing standing between the sedans, the cars. 31 of them, backed square into 31 spaces with the wheels straight, in a lot where nothing had moved since before I enlisted. My name's Alton Rickles. In June of 1987, I was 21 years old, and I was a signal specialist at Fort Campbell, which sits right on the line between Kentucky and Tennessee, about an hour north of Nashville. My job was radios. I fixed them. I sat in a shop with a soldering iron and a wooden crate full of handsets that other people had dropped, and I resoldered the little pins, and I wrote down what I had done in a log, and that was the Army for me. I want to say something about that year before I say the rest of it, because it explains why I handled it the way I did. It was peacetime. Vietnam had ended about a decade before I put the uniform on, and every senior man on that post had either been there or had spent 15 years being told he had missed it. We were next in line, in theory, except there was nothing to be next in line for. You had a lot of young men walking around a very large post feeling ornamental. The other half of it, and this part matters more, was the money. Peacetime means budget cuts, and budget cuts mean the Army starts looking for reasons to let people go. An NCO in my section used to say they were culling the herd, and he said it the way you would say it about cattle, without any particular feeling. Anything derogatory in your file made you easier to call. Anything medical made you easier to call. Anything psychological made you a great deal easier to call. You could be the best hand in the section, and one line in a folder would finish you. Everybody knew this. Nobody wrote it down anywhere. I had tried, once before, at a different post, to tell somebody in authority about a thing I could not account for. It went badly, in a quiet, career-shaped way. I do not hold it against them. I liked serving, and I am still proud of it. But I knew what the rules were. I had come to Campbell in January of '87 off a short deployment down to Central America. A few months after I got there, I picked up a temporary duty assignment with the Military Police Battalion. That happens. They were short, and I had a clean record, and somebody needed a warm body. And so a man, whose entire training was in radios, spent most of a summer riding a patrol truck at night. I liked it, actually. The reason is that Fort Campbell is enormous, and almost none of it is developed. The installation runs to something like 165 square miles. That is bigger than most American cities. It is 3 times the size of San Francisco, but a city that size is buildings, and Campbell is mostly not buildings. Campbell is trees. Hundreds of thousands of acres of standing hardwood with dirt roads cut through it, and ranges, and drop zones, and long stretches of chip seal where you can drive for 10 or 12 minutes between one thing and the next thing and never see a light. I had grown up in Tennessee, not far off. Being out on those back roads at night felt more like home than the barracks did. Get away from the post lights and the sky opens up. Not everybody felt that way. I got paired most of that summer with a man everybody called Wireman, on account of he could splice field wire faster than anyone in the battalion, and Wireman was from Newark and he hated the woods with a purity I found funny. He chewed cinnamon toothpicks, 6 a shift. Whenever we turned off pavement, he got quiet in a way that was not restful. The work was as dull as the work gets. 2 men, 1 truck, an M1009 with spotlights above the mirrors that you worked from inside the cab. At each stop you got out, walked the fence, shook a gate, pulled on a padlock, got back in, and drove 10 minutes to the next one. On the hour and the half hour you checked in whether you had anything or not, and the desk sergeant said your number back at you in a voice like a man reading a phone book. The one thing I want you to know about before I get to that night is the key ring. Every patrol truck carried a ring of keys the size of a saucer. There were dozens of them on it. Whoever had built that ring had done it over about 20 years, and there was no system to it that I was ever able to work out. The keys were not labeled. They were not grouped. There was, as far as anybody could tell, a key on that ring for every padlock on 165 square miles of army, and the only way to find the one you wanted was to start trying them. It was the standing joke of the shift. You would be out there in the dark with a flashlight in your teeth going through a fistful of keys while your partner made remarks. And there was a right way to chain a gate afterward. My section sergeant had taught it to me and had stood there and watched me do it until I got it. 7 turns of chain around the post, and the gate pipe, hasp through, lock through the 7th turn. Not 6, not 8, 7, because that was how many it took on a standard gate to leave no slack for a bar. He inspected me on it more than once. I can still do it. I do it constantly. I will get to that. Now, the lot. There was one location on our route that was unpleasant in the daylight, and that we had to check every single night. It was a long-term storage lot out on the far eastern side. Maybe 20 acres inside a 12-foot chain-link fence with 3 strands of barbed wire on outriggers along the top. Along the north side, there were storage garages that were still in use, holding unit equipment on long-term layaway. Field ranges. Tentage. A snowplow blade that nobody in Kentucky could ever explain to me. The rest of the lot was cars. The ones up near the front were ordinary. Soldiers who deployed stored a vehicle there rather than let it sit in a barracks lot for a year, and those had current stickers on them, and they were fine. The back rows were not those. In the back rows there were 31 cars with plates that ran from about 1968 to 1972. Every tire on every one of them was dry rotted, flat down to the rim. The interiors had gone to dust and mouse. There were wasp nests in 3 of them that I knew of. A Rambler, 2 Impalas, a Ford Galaxy with a Trigg County dealer badge still screwed to the trunk lid, a Corvair with a Georgia plate that had expired in '71. What we were told, and I want to be careful because nobody official ever confirmed it, was that those had belonged to men who went to Vietnam and did not come home, and whose families never came for the cars. I have no idea if that is true, but it had been handed down long enough that everybody said it in the same words. You can imagine what that does to a lot at 2 in the morning. It was the middle of June. The chip seal on the east perimeter had been oiled a couple of weeks before, and the whole side of the post still smelled like tar. There was no wind at all. The tree line past the lot was full of fireflies, the way it gets in Kentucky in June. Thousands of them going in that slow, soft way they do. We came up the perimeter road at maybe 15 miles an hour with the windows down, and I heard a chain move. One link. One clear note of metal against metal, somewhere inside the fence. I want to explain why that stopped me because on its own it is nothing. A chain does not make one sound. If wind moves a chain, you get a run of sounds. If a chain settles, you get 2 or 3 as it takes up. One single note means something lifted it and put it down. I said to pull up. Wireman pulled up. He put his spotlight down the fence line and worked it slow, and I got the hand held out and worked the other direction, and for maybe 40 seconds there was not one thing to see, just the fence and the grass and the dark shapes of cars going back into it. Then I noticed the row. I had driven that perimeter 40 or 50 times by then, maybe more. You do not think you are memorizing a place, but you are. And what I was looking at in the second row back was the profile of a line of cars, and it was the wrong profile. Those cars faced in. I knew they faced in the way you know the furniture in your own front room. Trunks to the fence, hoods toward the middle of the lot. They were facing out. I did not say it for a good minute. I sat there with the light on them, and I ran through everything I could think of that would let a man say that out loud and still be considered a reliable person. I could not find one. So, what I finally said was, "Does that row look right to you?" And Wireman said, "Which row?" And I said, "That one." And he looked at it for a while, and then he said, in a very small voice, that he did not come out here enough to know, which was fair, and which left it with me. We drove down to the nearest gate, and I got out with the key ring. That took a while, the way it always did. I had the flashlight in my left hand along with the ring, and I was going through keys with my right, and every 15 seconds or so I would stop and put the light back through the fence, which was useless, because the truck headlights were behind me and all they did was make the dark past them worse. Wireman had his door open and was standing behind it working the spotlight with one hand. I got the lock open. I pulled the chain out of the hasp and swung the right-hand leaf of the gate back, and I had to lift it by the pipe to clear the ground because it sagged, and I remember doing that. And I remember thinking that somebody ought to put a new hinge on it. And I stepped through, and about 100 yards in, something stood up. The fireflies had stopped. I want to put that first, because it is what I actually registered first before I understood what I was looking at. The whole tree line behind the lot had been going the entire time we had been there, and it was not going anymore. Not scattered, not dimmed down. They had simply quit doing it all at once, the way a room goes quiet. Then the shape. It came up between two sedans, and the roofs of those cars came to about its waist. I know how tall I am, and I knew how tall that fence was, and I have done that arithmetic more times than I would like to admit. It was upright on two legs. I could tell you about the shoulders. I could tell you it did not swing its arms and that it did not shift its weight the way a person standing still shifts his weight. I could not tell you the head. I still cannot. My light was on it, and there was nothing there to resolve, and the dark is not the reason, because I could see the cars on either side of it perfectly well. It was like a photograph that is out of focus in one place only. It was holding something. Both hands low, out in front of it. It did not come toward me. That is the thing people always expect, and it is not what happened. It stood there. I could not tell you for how long. Long enough that I became aware I had stopped breathing properly and had to start again on purpose. Then it bent down and put the thing on the ground, and then it adjusted it. That is the part. Not the size, not the standing, not any of it. It set that object down and then it moved it a little, the way you would straighten a picture, and then it took its hands away. I do not remember walking backward to the truck. I know I did, because I was at the truck, and I know I had not turned around, because I could still see it when I got there. Wireman was already in the seat. Neither of us said a word. He put it in gear and we went. We left the gate standing wide open. I want that on the record because it becomes important. Chain out of the hasp, padlock in my hand, right-hand leaf swung all the way back against the fence. We drove about 2 miles, and then Wireman slowed down to a normal speed and asked me if we were calling it in, and I said no, and he did not argue. I radioed the location clear. Here is the part I find hardest to explain to people. We finished the shift. We did 4 more stops, and somewhere around the 3rd one, Wireman said, in a completely ordinary voice, that it was probably a duty NCO doing a layout inventory in the storage garages, and I said that it probably was, and for about 20 minutes both of us genuinely believed that. We discussed it seriously. Which unit would be doing a layout at that hour, whether they would have come in through the north gate. whether the row of cars had ever faced in at all, or whether I had it backwards. It was a real conversation between two reasonable men, and I have thought about it for 38 years. How badly we both wanted it, and how fast we got there. The sun came up around 5. It gets light early in June. We had to go back. That gate was open, and it was our gate, and there was no version of that shift where we did not go back and close it. So, a little after sunrise, we came up the perimeter road again, in daylight, with the windows up this time. Both of us braver. The tar smell was already coming off the road, and I remember wiremen saying, from about a quarter mile out, that the gate was shut. It was shut. Chain through the hasp, 7 turns. I got out and stood in front of it. 7 turns around the post, and the gate pipe, hasp through, lock through the 7th, laid up neat, no slack anywhere in it. The way my section sergeant had spent an afternoon teaching me, the way I had left every other gate on that route all summer, and the way I had not left this one. The lock was a sergeant in Greenleaf, the standard pattern, stamped with that lot's own number in the place where the number goes. My padlock was in my pocket. I checked. It was in my pocket, open, where I had put it. I took the key ring off the dash and I tried it. Every key. All of them, twice, and then a third time on the ones that looked close. Standing there in the daylight, going through a ring of keys that opened every gate on that installation. Not one of them would turn. Wireman had walked up the fence line about 30 feet, and he called me over without raising his voice. The barbed wire along the top of that whole run had sagged for as long as anybody could remember. 2 of the strands had been loose enough to lift by hand. They were not loose. Every strand was a tension, all 3 of them, tighter than any contractor ever set them. And where the wire ran through the standoffs, the twists had all been turned the same direction. Not repaired. There was nothing broken. It had been tensioned. We drove the outside of the fence at about 5 miles an hour, and I looked in through the chain link at the back rows. 31 cars, backed into 31 spaces, square to the lines, wheels straight, evenly spaced, every one of them facing out, on flat tires, on tires that had been flat since I was in grade school. There was a smell over that end of the lot that I have never once been able to place. It was not burning. The closest I've ever gotten is hot brake dust, and that is not right either, but it is what I say. We reported that we had found the barbed wire disturbed. That is the phrase that went in. Wireman said it, and I did not add anything to it, and the desk sergeant wrote it down, and that was the entire official record of that night. I never told anybody in my chain of command. Neither did he. We talked about it twice more that summer, both times briefly, both times in a truck, and then he rotated and I have not spoken to him since 1989. I got out in 91. I have a little place now, 30-odd acres, and there is a gate on it. Here is what I do. I cannot walk past a chain hanging loose on anything, anywhere. A marina, a job site, a school fence, a dumpster corral, a pasture gate on a road I have no business on. I stop and I wrap it. 7 turns hasp through, lock through the 7th. My wife has watched me do it in a hospital parking garage. She does not say anything anymore. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. Maybe I just needed something to do with my hands after that. Probably that is all it is, but then again, maybe not. Somebody raked the snow. I know how that sounds as an opening. I have had 64 years to come up with a better one, and there is not a better one, because that is the whole of it. Somebody raked 4 inches of snow between those buildings, the entire length of the row, and there were no tracks under it. Prewitt. Denny Prewitt. In February of 1961, I was 19 years old, and I was a Marine standing guard on a fenced area inside Fort Campbell, on the Tennessee side, and I'm not going to tell you what was in it because I never knew. I want that understood before I go on. It was not a place a person asked questions about. There was a fence around the installation, and then there was another fence inside it. And inside that second fence there were rows of concrete buildings with earth banked over them and grass growing on the roofs, and a service road running between them. And my badge got me to the gate of that inner fence, and it never once got me past it. 11 months. I stood post on the outside of those buildings in every kind of weather, and I could not tell you what was on the other side of a single one of those doors. I was picked for that duty. I do not say that to boast. They looked at your record, and they looked into your people, and they made a determination about whether you were the kind of young man who stayed calm and did not talk. And I passed that determination, and I would like that on the record before I tell you the rest. The post was 4 hours. You walked or you stood, depending on the weather and how much you cared about your feet. And you had a parka and mitten shells with the trigger finger split out, and there was a field telephone on a post at the middle of the run. That telephone is the thing I need to explain. It was an EE-8, the hand-cranked kind, in a leather case with a strap. It had exactly one function on that post. On the hour, every hour, it rang. You lifted it, and you said your post number, and the sergeant of the guard said a word, and you said a word back, and he hung up. The words changed daily. That was the whole exchange. And I would like you to understand what it was to a 19-year-old alone in the dark in February. It was the only human sound in 4 hours. You waited for it. You would not admit to waiting for it. There was a challenge and password as well, changed daily along with the telephone words, and I will tell you the small thing about that which nobody ever puts in a book. You are more afraid of forgetting it than you are of anything you might have to challenge. A corporal I knew forgot his in December and had to stand there in front of a lieutenant while it got sorted out, and he was not the same for a month. That is the actual texture of standing guard. Not danger. The fear of being the one who got it wrong. Back in the barracks, there was a coal stove and a line strung over it for socks, and the smell of wet wool over coal is the smell of that whole winter to me. You came off post and you got your boots off, and somebody had left you a place near the stove, or he had not, and that told you where you stood with the detachment better than anything anybody said. The lights out there were sodium on poles, spaced maybe 120 feet, and they were slow. When one struck, it came up dull red and took about a minute and a half to get to orange. Each one threw a hard circle on the snow and left the ground between the poles completely black. So the row at night was a chain of orange coins with nothing in between them. That night, there were 4 inches down and none falling. Clear. Cold enough that the snow squeaked, which is a specific sound, and it only happens below a certain temperature, and a man who stands outside for a living learns to hear it in his own boots without thinking about it. I went on post at midnight. The 1 o'clock ring came and was normal. The 2 o'clock ring came and was normal. At about 20 minutes to 3, the telephone rang. There is no such thing as a wrong number on a field line with 2 instruments on it. There is no exchange. There is a wire, and there is a box at each end of the wire, and if one rings, it is because the other one was cranked. I lifted it, and I said my post number, and there was nobody there. Not silence, exactly. There was line noise, the little hiss you get, so the circuit was up. I said my post number again. I gave it a good long while. Then I cranked back, and the sergeant of the guard answered on the second ring and asked me what I wanted, and I told him he had just called me, and he said he had not. He checked the line at his end and told me it was fine. I stood there with my hand on the case for longer than I needed to. The next thing was the snow, and it took me a while to work out what I was noticing. I became aware, standing still, that I had stopped hearing footsteps, which was strange because I had not been walking. So I shifted my weight on purpose, and my boots squeaked the way they had been squeaking all night. So it was not my ears and it was not the cold. It was that somewhere down the row, between the buildings, snow was being disturbed, and it was making no sound at all. I want to be careful here. I did not hear anything. That is precisely the point. What I heard was the shape of a sound that should have been there, the way you know a clock has stopped by the quiet, not by looking at it. Something was moving that snow, in a place where snow cannot be moved silently, and the silence was the thing that reached me. I did not leave my post. I want to say that plainly. Whatever else happened that night, I did not take one step off the ground I was assigned. And at 19, that was the only thing in the world I was certain of. Then the lights started. The third pole down went out. Then the fourth. Then the third came back, running up from red the way they do. I watched that whole cycle twice, maybe 3 or 4 minutes apart. I reported the first one. I did not report the second one, and I have thought about why, and I believe the answer is that I'd already begun deciding what kind of night this was going to be in my file. The deer came sometime after that. 2 of them, standing in the open on the service road inside the inner fence. I could not tell you how they got in there, and nobody has ever explained it to me, then or since. They were facing the same direction, both of them, up the row toward the far end. I walked past them at about 15 feet on my next circuit, and they did not move. Not startled, not tensed. They stood there, facing up the row like 2 people waiting on a bus. The 4 o'clock ring came on time, and the sergeant's voice was bored, and I have never in my life been so pleased to hear a bored man. And that fixed it for a while. Bad ballast in a light. Wet connection in a field line, which happens constantly and which every Marine who has ever laid wire will tell you about. Deer are stupid. Everybody knows deer are stupid. I stood the last half hour of that post feeling foolish in a warm sort of way, and I remember thinking I would tell it as a funny story at breakfast, and then deciding I would not, because it was not that funny. It was starting to get light when I walked the row for the last time before my relief. The snow between the buildings had been raked. Not swept, not tracked through. Raked into the long herringbone pattern that the ground section puts into the gravel beds in the summer. The one that goes down the middle and then out at an angle to each side, over and over, like the bones of a fish. It ran between every pair of buildings on that row. Hundreds of feet of it. I got down on my knees at the near end and put my light along it flat, which is how you look at a surface. There was nothing under it. No boot print, no drag, no track of any kind, nothing but 4 inches of clean, raked snow going away from me down the row in that pattern, and the little ridges of it standing up sharp the way fresh work stands up. And it stopped 1 pace short of where I was standing. Not at the corner of a building, not at a line on the ground. It stopped about a stride from the toes of my boots, and the last stroke of it was finished the way you finish a stroke, tapered off clean, and then there was the plain snow, and then there was me. I stood up, and I did not move for a while. Here is the flat fact of it, and I will give it to you the way it was given to me later that morning. There was no rake on that site. The ground shed was outside the inner fence, and it was locked for the winter, because there is no grounds work in a Tennessee February, and there had not been any since November. When they opened it that morning, and they did open it because a captain wanted an answer as much as I did, the rake was hanging on its 2 nails where it hangs. No snow on it, no melt on the tines, and no rust on the tines, in the places where there had been rust, which the foreman noticed and I did not. His name was Cheatwood, a civilian in his 60s, and he took a lot of pride in those gravel beds. He came out and he looked at that herringbone for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, without anybody asking him, that it was left-handed. I did not know what he meant. He showed me. When a right-handed man rakes a herringbone, he leads with one shoulder and the strokes go one way. When a left-handed man does it, they go the other way. Nobody at the ground section was left-handed. He said it the way a carpenter tells you a joint was cut by somebody who was not a carpenter, which is to say without any drama, as a matter of trade. The other thing was along the buildings. At the base of every one of those concrete walls, both sides of the row, the snow had been drawn back exactly 1 hand's width from the concrete. A clean margin, all the way down, both sides, the same width everywhere, like somebody had gone along with a straight edge. I do not know why that is the part that stays with me. It is not the frightening part, but it is the part I see. They wrote it up as an unauthorized entry with no loss and no damage. I gave a statement. I was asked twice in a friendly way whether I had left my post, and I said no both times, and I believe they believed me. And I stayed on that duty another 6 months and nothing else ever happened. I never saw one thing that night. I want to end on that. I did not see a shape or a light in the sky or anything a man could argue with me about. I saw snow in the morning. I keep a rake by my back door. I rake leaves with it, and I rake the gravel by my mailbox, and in the winter I rake snow, which my neighbors think is the funniest thing they have ever seen an old man do. I do the herringbone, down the middle and out to the sides. I do it right-handed because I am right-handed, and it comes out the other way from the one I saw, and I'm always faintly aware of that while I'm doing it. Probably I picked it up in the service. That is what I tell people when they ask, which is not often. And maybe that is all it is. There was a parachute laid out in the middle of that field, flaked and folded and ready to pack, and it was dry. Everything else out there was soaking. That is the part I would like you to hold on to while I tell the rest, because everything else follows from it. I was a rigger. 26 years old in October of 1978, working out of a shed on the western training area at Fort Campbell. And if you want my name, it is Creech, Yolanda Creech. People called me Creech, and I preferred it. Here's the thing about riggers that makes this story mean anything. A rigger jumps the chutes she packs. That is not a motto somebody painted on a wall. It is the actual rule. They pull one out of the run at random, and you put it on and you go out the door with it. And everybody in the trade knows this from the first week, and it does something to how you work. When I tell you I know what my own packing looks like, understand that I know it the way you know your own handwriting, because the alternative was finding out about a mistake from 1,200 feet. There are 2 pieces of the trade you need for this. The first is the seal. When a chute is packed and closed, the closing tie gets a little lead seal crimped onto it with a press. The press is a small numbered die, and it is issued to you personally. Mine had my number on it, and it lived in a locked box, and the key to that box was on a bootlace around my neck. 24 hours a day, in the shower, asleep, all of it. The whole legal weight of the trade sits on the fact that a seal cannot be put on by anybody but the person it was issued to. If a seal is on a chute, that person closed it. There is no other reading. That is the entire system. The second is flaking. Flaking is how you lay a canopy out before you fold it. You get the thing on a table, you find your gores. A T10 has 30 of them, 30 triangular panels running from skirt to apex, and you separate them out in order and stack them so the whole canopy lies flat and true, with every line running clean and nothing crossed. Then you S-fold it down into the pack tray. It is a procedure. It is taught one way, it is inspected one way, and it is a right-handed procedure, in the sense that everything about the sequence assumes you are standing on a particular side and leading with a particular hand. Left-handed riggers learn it right-handed. Everybody does it the same way, which is the point of it. I loved that shed. I want to put that in because everything after this is strange, and I do not want you to think I was unhappy out there. It was a long building with the packing tables running down the middle of it, 40 feet of table, and a drying tower at one end that went up 2 stories so a canopy could hang full length. It smelled like nylon and talc and floor wax. When you pull a canopy down a table, it makes a sound like a wave going out. And if there were 4 of us working at once, the whole building sounded like the ocean. And I would have stayed in that trade my whole life if the Army had let me. My section sergeant was a man named Hollinsworth, who had been packing since Korea, and who had exactly 2 compliments, which were, "That will do," and, very rarely, nothing at all, which was the higher of the 2. He inspected me on flaking my first month, and he stood at my shoulder and did not say one word for 11 minutes, and then he walked off, and I went out to the truck and cried about it, and I have never been prouder of anything. All right. The night. There had been a night jump at about 2200, onto a division drop zone out west of the cantonment area. An old hayfield gone to broom sedge, a mile long, corner-marked ground fog, always in the low end. When a jump goes in at night, the recovery runs until 2 or 3 in the morning. You take a truck out with the tarp off, and you drive the field, and you pick up canopies and account for them by number against the manifest. The enemy is due. A canopy on the ground soaks through in about 20 minutes, and then it weighs what a wet tent weighs, and it has to be hung in the drying tower for a day before anybody can touch it, and a 2-hour recovery becomes 4. Every rigger on earth has stood in a wet field at 1 in the morning, hating dew, personally. Broom sedge and headlights goes silver, by the way. I do not know why that stayed with me out of all of it, but it did. We were 3 on the detail with a deuce and a half, and we ran the headlights, which you are not supposed to do on a blacked-out drop zone in which nobody was out there to care about. I had my count. That is what I want to be clear about. My count was good, and everything on the manifest was accounted for and radioed back to the shed. And there was a canopy in the low end that was not on it. I went down to it on foot with a handheld, thinking it was a stray from the afternoon lift, and it was laid out. Not dumped, not half collected. Laid out, on the grass, in the fog, the full length of the thing. Gores separated and stacked and S-folded. Lines run out clean with not one crossed, ready to go into a pack tray. Somebody had done a table job on the ground, in the dark, in a field. I got down on my knees beside it. And that is when I put my hand on it and my hand came up dry. I did not believe it. So I put my hand flat on the grass 6 inches away and it came up wet to the wrist. And I did that again. And then I did it 3 or 4 more times, moving around the thing, grass canopy, like an idiot, kneeling in a hayfield at 1:30 in the morning. And I could not make it stop being true. There was a light at the far end of the field, over the tree line. I want to be careful about it because it is the only thing I saw, and it was not much. It was steady, and it was low, and it was not moving. The wind that night was out of the southwest at 8 or 9, and everything up there was going somewhere. Cloud, the airfield beacon glow, all of it moving. This was not. And behind it, this is the part I have never gotten anybody to picture. The tree line stopped having a shape. I can draw you the trees to the left of it, and I can draw you the trees to the right of it. There was oak and hickory along that whole north end, and a dead sycamore we all used as a corner reference. And in the middle of that, over a span, I would guess it, 40 or 50 feet, there was no edge, not darkness, not fog, just nowhere for my eye to land. I looked at it, and then I stopped looking at it. That is not courage, and I am not going to dress it up. I turned my back on it, and I did my job, because my job was standing there in front of me and the other thing was 400 yards away and not mine. I got the canopy up off the grass. That is a 2-person lift when it is wet and a 1-person lift when it is dry, and I did it alone without thinking about what that meant, and I was halfway to the truck with it over my shoulder before the weight registered. It weighed what a folded canopy weighs on a table indoors. 30-odd pounds of nylon that had been lying in a soaked hayfield for an unknown number of hours. And it went over my shoulder like laundry. The manifest had it as nothing. I called it back to the shed by number, and the number was not on the run. And the girl on the radio asked me to say it again. And I said it again. And she said, "Stand by." And then she came back and said, "Bring it in." The other two on the detail walked past that laid-out canopy twice while I was standing there. Neither of them said one word about it. I asked them the next day, separately, and both of them remembered picking up a chute in the low end, and neither of them remembered it being laid out. And one of them got short with me about it, like I was working up to accusing him of something. I loaded it, and I drove back, and by the time I got to the shed I had it solved. Day shift. Somebody had pulled a canopy for a repair inspection and laid it out in the field for the light, and never got back to it before knockoff. That is thin, and I knew it was thin, and I said it out loud in the cab anyway, to nobody, in a satisfied voice. It held about 11 minutes. The shed had fluorescents and a long packing table, and I got it up there and I did what I would do with any canopy I did not know the history of, which is walk the layout with a light. Every fold was standard. Every fold was backwards. The gores were separated in the correct order and stacked from the wrong side. The S fold went the other way down the table. It was the mirror of the procedure, all the way through, executed to a standard I would have signed for. Work I could not have done. I stood there and tried to do it in the air with my hands to see if a person even could, and I could not make my arms go that way. And then I got to the closing tie. There was a lead seal on it, crimped, and it had my number. My press was in my box. My box was 10 feet away and it was locked. And I want to tell you the single stupidest thing I have ever done in my life, which is that I stood there in that shed and pulled the bootlace out of my collar and looked at the key. To check. As if the key was going to be gone. It was on the lace. It had been on the lace all night. I had felt it against my chest every time I bent over in that field. I left the canopy on the table and I went and sat in the truck for a while. Here is the last of it. That shed door stood open to a wet field all night, the way it always did in October. In the morning, every canopy in there had beat it up. The way they do, the way you can see them go dull, that one was dry. It stayed dry. I turned it in through channels as a found item of unknown origin, which is a real category, and it went off somewhere, and I never heard another word about it, and I did not ask. I checked my own seals twice. I have not sealed anything in 30-odd years. The most consequential thing I close now is a suitcase. And I check it, and then I check it again. I have never once found anything wrong. I think I would be all right if I ever did. It is the not finding it that keeps me at it. 60 bunks, made up tight, in a building that had been empty since 1946. I will tell it, and you can do what you want with it. I have never asked anybody to believe me, and I am not going to start now at my age. Buell Rainwater. In January of 1971, I was 47 years old, and I tended steam on the old wooden row at Fort Campbell, which is a job that does not exist anymore, and that I would go back to tomorrow. Let me tell you what that row was. When they built that post in 1942, they threw up hundreds of two-story white-frame barracks on brick piers, and they built them to last 5 years. Green lumber. You could feel the floors move when a man walked at the other end. By the time I got there in the 60s, they had been standing 30 years past their date, and most of them were empty, and some of them were used for storage, and a few of them still had soldiers in them, and every one of them had to be kept just warm enough that the pipes did not split. That was me. Coal-fired central plant at the end of the row, buried steam main running the length of it, condensate coming back, and steam traps in pits at intervals along the way. I came on at 10 at night and I came off at 6 in the morning, and in between I walked that row. I had been on it 11 years by that January. I could tell you which building a trap was under from the sound of it through a cast cover. Every one of them had a different knock. That is not any kind of gift. That is 11 years of listening to the same 40 things. There was a slate in each boiler room with the hours chalked down the side, and I marked each one as I checked it and initialed the bottom at the end of the shift. That was the only proof I was ever there, and the only thing anybody ever looked at. And I carried a string line in the truck. Mason's twine, yellow, on a spool, for setting pipe hangers straight when I had a run to do. I had been working off the same spool for about 2 years. That will matter shortly. The plant itself was a good place to be at 3 in the morning. Coal came in on a stoker and the ash came out in a cart, and there was a chair by the boiler front that had been worn into a shape. And if you sat in it for 10 minutes with the door cracked, you could not stay awake, which is why I did not sit in it. Trice had the day shift, and we overlapped about 20 minutes, and he talked about his boat, which he did not have yet and never did get. Nobody could ever keep the building numbers straight on that row, because they had torn some down over the years and never renumbered anything. So you would have 34 and 36, and then a gap of grass and then 41, and a new man could lose an hour looking for 38. I had it all in my head. I could have walked it blind. And here is a thing about those buildings that I did not think about at all until later. During the war, every one of them had a fire watch. Green lumber, coal stoves, 200 men asleep upstairs. So, all night long, every night, in every building on that row, there was one man awake and walking. That was the rule for 4 years. I knew that the way you know any old thing about a place you work, it did not mean anything to me. It has meant something to me since. There was a dog under building 39, a brindle female, and I fed her and she walked that whole round with me every night for 2 years. I called her sister. She is in this too. The night I am telling you about was in the middle of a cold snap. Single digits after midnight, which we do not get often in Middle Tennessee and which the old road did not care for at all. That kind of cold is when a steam man earns it. You are pulling pit covers all night in the dark with a light in your teeth. I came up on building 41 at about 1:30. 41 had been valved off at the main since 68. Nobody in it, nothing in it, nothing coming to it. I had walked past that building 6 nights a week for 3 years the way you walk past a rock. The windows were fogged on the inside. Now, there are ordinary reasons for that, and I went through them standing in the road. Rain the day before, sun on the west side, a broken pane letting damp in. None of them work at 9 degrees on a clear night in a building with no heat, and I knew it while I was thinking it. But you go through them anyway. That is what a working man does. So I pulled the pit cover outside 41. The trap was cycling. I could hear it before I had the cover halfway off. That regular knock a bucket trap makes when it is passing condensate, which is the most ordinary sound in the world, and which that trap had no business making, because there was nothing feeding it. I went down into the pit with the light. 2-foot drop, water in the bottom the way there always was, and the main valve was shut. Not part shut. Shut, with the hand wheel where I had last seen it, and the paint on the stem unbroken. I put my bare hand on the pipe on the building side of that shut valve. It was hot, not warm. Hot enough that I took my hand off it the way you do. There is no arrangement of pipe and valve on God's earth where that happens. Steam does not go around a gate valve. I have thought about it for 50-odd years, and I have talked to 2 men who knew more about steam than I did, and neither of them would touch it. I got up out of the pit and put the cover back on, because I am not the kind of man who leaves a pit open. The smell was on the steps, wool, floor wax, a little coal smoke. In a building that had held nothing but mouse and dust since Truman was president, standing at the bottom of those steps in 9-degree air, I smelled a barracks, not an old barracks. A barracks with men living in it. Sister came up to the corner of 41 and stopped. She did not bark, she did not back off either. She sat down at that corner with her feet square under her, and she would not come one step further, and she watched me, and she waited. 2 years of that dog going everywhere I went, into pits, into boiler rooms, under buildings. She sat at that corner the entire time, and she was still sitting there when I came out. I want to tell you what I thought, because it will show you what a man will do with his own head. I decided a work crew had opened the building for storage without telling the plant. That happens. It had happened twice before that I knew of, some outfit needing space and going around the housing office, and the plant finding out 3 weeks later when a bill came. I got genuinely annoyed about it. I stood at the bottom of those steps in the cold composing what I was going to say to the housing office in the morning, whole sentences of it, and I went up those steps carrying that annoyance in front of me like a lantern. The door was not locked. I do not know if it ever had been. Inside, the hall had 4 inches of dust on the floor, and my boots went into it. I want that on the record. The hall was exactly what it had been every day for 25 years. I went up to the bay at the top of the stairs and I put my light in. The beam went across the floor first, and the floor was swept. Bare-board, swept clean, no dust in it anywhere, and I was standing in a doorway with dust to my ankle. Then I raised the light and it took the first row. Bunks made up. Blanket drawn tight over the mattress. Corners in square. Second blanket folded at the foot in a band about a hand deep. Pillow squared at the head. I moved the light and it took the second row and they were made. And the third, and I stood in that doorway and I walked that beam down 60 bunks in a room that had not held a man since the year after the war. And every single one of them was made the same, and the dust was going up in the light off my own clothes and settling on nothing. I did not go in. I want to be plain about that. I stood in the door the whole time and I never put a foot on that floor. The foot lockers were pulled out from under the bunks and lined up along the aisle. And they were straight. Not close to straight the way a thing is straight when it has been done to a line. The blankets were the current issue. That is the flat fact, and I will give it to you the way I got it. Not the wartime pattern, not what would have been in that building. The pattern that was being issued that year, out of a supply system, out of a warehouse, with paper behind every one of them. 60 of them. I know the difference because my brother-in-law worked in that warehouse, and I'd helped him move stock on a Saturday 4 months before. And I did put my hand on one. That much I did do on the nearest bunk from the doorway, leaning in with my arm out. It was not cold, and it was not warm. It was the temperature of a bed that somebody has just got out of. The line was under the lockers. Yellow mason's twine tied off to the pier post at the near end, and tied off to the pier post at the far end, drawn to tension, running the whole length of that aisle about 2 inches off the floor with 60-foot lockers set to it. It was my line. I do not mean it was like my line. Yellow twine is yellow twine, and I would not have said a word about it, except that the cut end at the near post was frayed the particular way my side cutters frayed twine, because they were dull, and I had been meaning to replace them since '69. I went out and down and across to the truck and put my hand on my spool. It was in the toolbox where it always was, and it was not short. There was as much on it as there had been at the start of the shift, and I know that because I had used a piece off it at Building 34 the night before, and I had noticed how much was left. I chalked my board, and I initialed the bottom, and I finished my round. In the morning, I told Trice, who had the day plant, that 41 wanted looking at. That is the exact phrase I used. He went down there sometime that week and he told me it was empty, and I said all right, and that was the end of it between us and the end of it in general. I never went in that building again. It came down in 76 with the rest of the row. Here is where it left me. I have not slept in an unmade bed since 1971. If I come in on a bed that is not made, I make it, and then I get in it. My wife thinks that is the Army in me, and I have never once corrected her, because I was never in the Army. I had a bad ear, and they would not take me, and it was the disappointment of my young life. She likes the answer she has got. I am not going to take it off her. At first light, the impact area was flagged, all of it, out to the limit of what the glass would show me. My name is Faye Brumley, and in the spring of 1994, I was 33 years old, and I worked range control at Fort Campbell, which meant that 4 or 5 nights a week I sat 40 feet up in a glassed tower and watched a piece of ground that nothing should ever be moving on. I want to explain the impact area first, because people hear the words and they picture a firing range, and it is not that. An impact area is where the rounds land. Fort Campbell's had been taking artillery and mortar and aerial gunnery since the early 40s. 50 years of it. And the thing nobody outside understands is that it is not that you are not allowed in there. It is that you cannot go in there. Not with a detector, not in a suit, not for a piece of equipment, not for a person. The density of unexploded ordnance in ground like that is beyond any clearance operation anybody has ever funded, and it gets worse over time and not better, because the older a dude is, the more delicate it gets. That ground was closed before I was born, and it will be closed after I am dead. There are men from the 40s still in some of those places, is the thing people say, and I do not know if it is true, and I never repeated it on duty. From the tower on a clear day, you could see maybe 4 miles of it. Scrub, blackened cedar from the burns, craters standing full of rainwater. In the spring, the frogs in those craters were loud enough to hear at 40 feet, and along the edges, where clearance teams had worked over the decades, there were marker flags. My job at night was not exciting, and I liked it that way. Firing windows, clearances. A unit calls and says what they are shooting and from where and at what, and you pull the fan for it and check it against everything else that is live and against the airspace. And if it is clean, you give them a window and a time, and you log it. And when they are done, they call and you close it out. It is bookkeeping with consequences. I was good at it, and it suited me, and I will not pretend otherwise. The tower was 40 feet of steel with an open stair up the outside and a glassed cab on top about the size of a small bedroom. There was a kerosene heater, a folding chair, a table, and a coffee maker that tripped the breaker if you ran it with the heater, which I found out in my first week and which nobody had warned me about, because that is how the Army teaches. In the spring, after a burn, that whole side of the post smelled like nothing else on earth. Not a wood fire smell. Burned cedar and burned wet ground and a mineral edge under it from whatever 50 years of ordnance leaves in dirt. I liked that too. I have never smelled it since, and I would know it instantly. And you watch. 2 things you need for the rest of this. The first is the acetate. The surface danger zone map lived on the tower table under a sheet of acetate, and you drew the night's firing fans on it in grease pencil and you wiped it at end of shift. I was fastidious about the wiping. That is not a personality trait. That is because a stale fan left on a map is exactly how somebody gets killed 2 shifts later. The second is the flags. The current marker flag in 1994 was orange, on a wire staff, with a particular crimp where the fabric attaches. Before that, and this went out somewhere around 1978, there was an older pattern. Stiffer material, more red in the orange, different crimp on the staff. There were none of those left on the installation. I know that because I had inventoried the range shed myself the previous November, and there was not one. There was a fox that denned under the tower stairs. Dog fox, I saw him most nights, and he ignored me completely, which I took as a compliment. I never fed him. There is a rule about that, and I followed it, and I have always been a little sorry. One more thing about the flags, and then I will get on with it. Clearance teams use different colors for different classes of find, so a flagged edge is not decoration. It is a record of what somebody found and what they decided about it. You learn to read a flag line the way you read a page. That is probably why the morning hit me the way it did. It was not that there were flags out there. It was that they were saying something. The night was ordinary until about 2:10. There was a light in the impact area, low, out about 2 miles, and I could read the grid straight off the map because I knew that ground the way you know a face. Steady. It was there 11 minutes by the clock, and I logged it as a possible trespass, which is not what it was, but possible trespass was the only category the log had, and I was not going to invent one. Here is what I want to say about that light, and it is the only description I have got. It did not illuminate anything. It was bright. I could not look straight at it for long, and there was no lit ground under it. Not dim ground, no lit ground at all, the scrub under it exactly as dark as the scrub 50 yards away, which is not a thing light does. I put the big binoculars on it, and the binoculars gave me a brighter version of the same nothing. 11 minutes, and then it was not there, and there was no fading and no moving off. About 20 minutes after that, the glass went warm. Not the room. The kerosene heater was on the far side, and the room was the temperature it always was, and I was in a jacket. The glass on the impact area side of the cab was warm to the palm. I put my hand flat on it and took it off and put it back 4 or 5 times, moving along the pane, and it was warm the whole length of that side and cold on the other 3, and there was nothing out there to be warm from. Then there was a knocking. Very low, very regular, spaced about 1.5 seconds. It went on for a long time. I want to say 20 minutes, and I know that memory stretches. I have never been able to get anybody to accept this part, and I understand why, because the direction I was certain about contains nothing at all. It was from the impact area, from out there, from ground, with no structure on it, and no equipment on it, and nothing standing on it but cedar. The fox was at the bottom of the stairs, sitting in the open, which he did not do, facing out at the impact area. He was there when I went down at 3 to walk around the truck, and he was there at 4, and he was there at 5, in the same place, and a fox does not do that. A fox is the most nervous animal in Kentucky. At about 4:30, I called range control and told them about the light, and the man on the desk said, without any hesitation at all, that there was a night training route that ran along that corridor and gave me the unit and the corridor number. I wrote it down, and it went away, the whole thing, just dissolved into ordinary army the way things do at the end of a shift. Helicopter. Warm glass, some trick of the heater in the pane. Frogs, or a loose cable slapping the tower leg, which happens. I closed the log entry and I felt foolish and cheerful, which is the standard emotional condition of the night shift at 6 in the morning. I went up the stairs one more time because the fog was lifting and it was going to be a clear one, and the impact area is beautiful at first light. That is the truth. That is why I went up. Flags. Not along the edges where the clearance work is. All of it. Out across the whole visible field of that ground, upright, in a grid, evenly spaced, going away from me in ranks until the glass could not resolve them anymore. Hundreds. I could not count them, and I tried. On ground that has never been cleared. On ground no living person has walked on since before the war ended. I stood there, and I did the thing you do, which is look for the vehicle. There is no vehicle. There is no road. There is no way in. Two things about those flags. They were the old pattern. Stiff, red-orange, the 78 crimp. I could see it in the glass at that distance because the material hangs differently, and I had been looking at flags for 6 years. There was not one of them in the range shed, because I had counted the range shed in November, and not one of them was standing in a crater. That ground is nothing but craters. 50 years of it. You cannot walk 20 feet out there without going down into something. Every single flag was on level ground in a grid spaced to the meter, laid out across terrain that does not have level ground in it. I sat down in the folding chair for a minute. Then I got up and looked again, because I had a very clear thought while I was sitting, which was that I had imagined it, and I wanted to be the one who proved that. They were still there. I put the binoculars on the nearest rank and got individual staffs, individual flags, the fabric hanging the way that fabric hangs. I called it in, and I did not care how it sounded, and to their credit, somebody took it seriously enough to put a helicopter up at about 10. The pilot reported the impact area clear, no flags, nothing. He flew it twice, and by then the tower glass was cold and the fox was gone, and I had been awake for 22 hours, and I could see on the desk sergeant's face the exact shape of what he had decided about me, and I did not blame him, and I have never blamed him. There is one more thing, and then I am done. My acetate was wiped. It was wiped because I wiped it, at the end of the shift, the way I always did. And underneath where the fan had been, there was a grid of grease pencil dots. Faint, very regular, even spacing. I did not draw them, and I could not get them off. I went at that sheet with the cloth, and then with alcohol, and then with my thumbnail, and they stayed. And eventually somebody replaced the acetate and threw the old sheet out, and I have thought many times that I should have taken it home, and I did not, because taking it home would have meant admitting what I thought it was. I count flags. Surveyor's flags on a road job, the little ones at a golf course, the ones they put in your yard before they dig. I count them, and then I check the spacing, and I do this in the passenger seat of my daughter's car at 55 miles an hour, and she has learned not to ask. I could not tell you what I would do about it. Probably nothing. I would just like to know it is people doing it. 9 acres of burley got topped in one night, and there was not a footprint in it. I have carried that for 70 years, and I have never once found the end of it. I am going to tell it plain, and then I am going to say the thing at the end that is the real reason I still think about it. And it is not the part you would expect. My name is Ruby Deathridge. In August of 1955, I was 24 years old, and I was a civilian gate guard on the Kentucky side of Fort Campbell, on a farm road gate in the Christian County fence, and I worked nights because nights were what I was offered. I was the only woman on the gate rotation. I am going to leave that there. It was 1955, and I got the shift nobody wanted, and I was glad to have it. And there is not much more to say about it that has not been said better by other people. The gate was a wire gate on a chained post, a wooden shack about the size of an outhouse, a stool, a kerosene lamp, a coffee can of sand for cigarettes, and a fan that moved hot air from one side of the shack to the other. There was a hand-cranked telephone on the wall, and the next post was 1.5 miles off. Back of the gate, a lease road ran onto Army ground to 9 acres of burley tobacco. Now, I need to explain the lease, because people do not know about it. When the Army bought that land in 1941, they took in a great deal of farm ground, and a good many families sold under condemnation and then stayed on and farmed the same ground under a permit. So you would have a man working a field his daddy worked, on land that was not his anymore, and going through a gate to get to it. That was the Ferrand place. Mr. Ferrand was 71 that summer. I was raised in tobacco, set it, topped it, cut it, housed it. I say that so you understand that a tobacco field is not a mystery to me. It is the most boring thing in the world to me, and I know what one looks like at every hour of its life. Topping is the job I hated worst. Burley comes up, and along about August, it puts out a bloom at the top, and you have to break that bloom off, every plant, by hand, so the strength goes into the leaf instead of the seed. And then within a few days the plant answers you by throwing suckers out where the leaves join the stalk, and you have to go back down every row and pull those too, and they come out sticky and black, and it gets on your arms, and it does not wash off with soap. It is hot, it is slow, it is bent over, and it is the most hated work of the whole crop year. Ask anybody who did it. And there are worms in it. Hornworms, big as your finger, green, and they are on the underside of a leaf, and you do not see them until your hand is on one. I have known grown men to come out of a row over a worm. My Uncle D would not top at all on account of them, and everybody in the family pretended to believe his back was the reason. 9 acres is a crew. 9 acres is a week of a crew. Mr. Farah had 2 grandsons who did that field with him, and both of those boys had been called away that summer. Everybody on that road knew it. It was the whole conversation at the store for about a week, that the old man was going to have to top 9 acres by himself, at 71, and that he was going to try, and that nobody could work out what to do about it, because he would not take help offered as charity, and there was not any other kind on offer. There had been 2 days of hard rain, and it had quit the evening before. That ground was soft. You could put a boot in it and leave a print an inch deep, and it would hold that print a week. I want that in your mind now, early, before anything else happens. And there was a mule in the lot by the Farron barn, a quarter-mile off. Pet, they called her. That mule brayed at everything. At a car, at a dog, at nothing whatsoever, all night, every night, and I had gotten so I did not hear her. August in Kentucky at night does not cool off. It gets dark, and it stays hot, and your shirt does not dry from the day, and the katydids start up in the tree line and go all night at a pitch that gets into your teeth. There was a church at the crossroads and a store beside it, and by 10 o'clock there was not a light on at either one. And after that the only light in the world was my lamp and whatever the sky was doing. I went on at 10. At about 1 in the morning there were headlights on the lease road, coming toward me from back in on Army ground, which is wrong to begin with because nothing had gone in that way, and my log said so. 2 lights, the right distance apart, the right height off the ground, the right color for that year, moving at the speed a truck moves on a bad road, and they did not light the road. I want to be careful, because that is the only thing I saw all night, and I've had a long time to talk myself out of it. I could see the lights, I could see them clearly, 2 of them coming on, and the road under them was as dark as the road behind them. Nothing lit up. No fence post catching it, no ruts showing, no dust in the beam, and there is always dust. They came about halfway, and then they were not there. They did not go out and they did not turn off. They stopped being. Nothing came through my gate, my page says so. It said so the next morning when a captain read it, and it says so now, wherever it is. The second thing was the field. Burley in August makes a sound at night. It is a dry, wet rustle, and it comes in patches as the air moves across a field, here and then, over there, and then nothing for a while. It is one of the most ordinary sounds of my whole childhood. That night, the whole 9 acres went at once. All of it, in one motion, and then again, on a night when there was not a breath moving. I had the shack door open because of the heat, and there was not enough air to move the smoke off a cigarette. And 9 acres of tobacco was going like something walking through it, except that when a thing walks through tobacco, you hear where it is. And this was everywhere at the same time. Then, along about 3, the smell. Green tobacco has a smell when you break it. Sharp and sticky and a little sweet, and if you were raised in it, you cannot mistake it for anything else in this world. At 3 a.m, that gate smelled the way a field smells at noon with a crew in it, and there was nobody out there. Pet did not make a sound between 1 and 4. I noticed it the way you notice a clock stopping. She was quiet the whole of it, and in the morning she was standing at the fence facing the field, and she stayed there. Here's what I decided, and I want you to know I was happy about it. I decided the boys had come home. That is the whole of it. I got it into my head somewhere around 4 that those 2 grandsons had gotten leave or gotten let go from wherever they were and had come in the back way off the county road, which a person could do, and were out there in the dark topping their granddaddy's field before he woke up. Because that is what you would do. That is exactly what you would do. I sat on that stool for 2 hours with that in my chest, and I was near to crying about it. And I have never in my life been so pleased with a wrong idea. It got light around 5. 9 acres, topped, every plant. I walked down to the end of the field when my relief came and stood at the head of the rows, and the blooms were broken off clean at the right node, everyone. The way you do it when you are fresh and not the way you do it at the end of a long row when your hands hurt. The suckers were pulled. And it was not just done, it was good. Better than a crew does it, better than anybody does it. And laid at the end of every row in the grass were the blooms, gathered up and put down in bundles about the size of what a hand can hold, all the same size, all laid with the stems the same way. As many bundles as there were rows. 2 days of rain in that ground. There was not one print between those plants. Not a boot, not a bare foot, not a knee where somebody knelt, not a drag, not a place where a bucket had been set down. 9 acres of mud, soft enough to take a print an inch deep and hold it, and it was as smooth as the morning after the rain quit. Mr. Ferrand came down at 6 with his hat in his hand to start work. He got out of his truck and walked to the end of the field, and he stopped. He stood there a long time. He did not go in. He looked down 1 row, and then he walked along the head of the field and looked down another one, slow, all the way along, and then he came back to his truck and sat down on the running board and cried. I did not go to him. I have thought about that for 70 years. I was 24, and I was a girl in a uniform shirt from a company that guarded gates. And he was an old man from a family that had lost that ground before I was born, and I stood at my post about 40 feet away and I let him be. Maybe that was right. I do not know. I have never known. He said one thing to me later, when he came past the gate with his hat back on. He said, "Well, it's done." That is all he said. He drove out and he never mentioned it again, and neither did I, and he died in 1963. I cannot look at a tobacco field from a road. I take the long way, and in Kentucky there is always a long way. And here's the thing I said I would come back to, and it is not the headlights and it is not the sound. It was a kindness. That is what I cannot get around. Whatever was out there in that field, it did the worst job on that farm. All of it, in one night, for an old man who could not have done it himself. And it laid the blooms up neat at the end of the rows, and it did not stay for a thank you. I have never known what to do with that. 70 years, and I have never once known what to do with it. I left 40 vehicles unchained on that train, and at first light every one of them was chained down. I am going to tell you what a binder is before I tell you anything else, because if you do not know what a binder is, then none of this is going to land. It is a lever. You hook one end to a chain and the other end to a chain, and you throw the lever over and it pulls the slack out and locks past center. That is all it is. And a correct one you can feel in your shoulder. There's a specific amount of effort, and then it goes over and sits, and a wrong one either goes over too easy or fights you the whole way. You do a few thousand of them and you stop thinking about it entirely. Your body knows. Cargyle, Delphine. Cargyle, and nobody has called me Delphine since my mother died. Del. In January of 1991, I was 35 years old, and I was a movement sergeant at the railhead at Fort Campbell, and I had been awake for something close to 40 hours. You know what was happening that January. I am not going to make a speech about it. The division was going, and everything the division owned was going with it, and the way that happens is a railhead. You drive it all into a yard, you put it on flat cars, you chain it down, and the train leaves at a time somebody in an office picked. That is the part the civilians never understand about a deployment. It is not dramatic. It is freight. 90-odd flat cars in that yard, floodlights on poles, sodium, humming, ramps at the end and spanners between the cars so a vehicle can drive the length of the train. Spotters walking backwards in the dark, waving lights. Chalk crews and chain crews working behind them, and freezing rain coming down sideways all night, which turns a steel deck plate into the most dangerous surface in Kentucky, and we had sand buckets out and we went through all of them by 2 a.m. There is more procedure in it than anybody wants to hear about. You bleed the tires down to a set pressure, so a vehicle sits into the deck instead of rolling on it. You chalk front and rear. The load plan is a physical document, a real object, acetate over a car-by-car sequence with weights worked out so the train is balanced end to end. And it is the most boring, beautiful thing I have ever been responsible for. I had 2 good people that night, a sergeant named Tillery and a specialist named Bose who was 19 and who did not complain one time in 30 hours, which I have never forgotten. A rail yard smells like creosote and diesel and wet steel, and in freezing rain it smells like all 3 of those and cold on top. I can still get it if I stand near a railroad. I will say one thing about the town and then leave it. There were people at the fences that week. There were churches on the Clarksville side with their lights on at 2 a.m. for anybody who wanted to sit in them. I did not go, and I did not look at the fences, because I had a train to load, and because looking would not have helped me do it. The clock is the enemy. That is the whole job. The train has a departure, and the yard has more vehicles than it has hours. And every single decision you make all night is which corner to cut. I want to be honest about the chains, because it matters. Every tie-down chain in the inventory carries a stamp, a maker's mark and a working load, on a tag or right in the link. And part of the preload inspection is running your hand down the chain until you find it. That is a hard rule. An unmarked chain is an unusable chain, and there are a lot of dead people behind that rule, most of them civilians on highways. I did it by feel, in the dark, in gloves, thousands of times. You find the stamp with your thumb without looking at it, and I ran out of time. I had 40 vehicles spotted on cars at the far end of that train, and no crew left to chain them, because the crews had been going since the morning before, and there is a point where you send people to rest or you start hurting them. So, a little after 3, I sent them. And I stood in that yard by myself and looked at 40 vehicles sitting loose on flat cars, and I knew exactly what that was, and I knew whose name was on the load plan. Mine. It is always the person who signs. So that is where I was, alone in a yard at 3 a.m. with a handheld and a clipboard, and the specific kind of sick feeling you get when the problem is entirely your own fault. The lights went down at about 3:20. Not out. Down. Every pole in the yard at once, dimming to maybe a quarter, and then coming back over about 4 seconds. It happened, and I stood there, and then it happened again a minute or 2 later. I got the generator crew on the radio, and they had nothing. Their gauges never moved. That is the part they were annoyed about, actually. Not that the lights dipped, but that their instruments said the lights had not dipped. Then the chains. 90 flat cars of chained vehicles, every chain on every one of them, sounding one note at the same time. Low. Not a rattle. A note, the way a wire fence sings when you put a hand on the post, and I felt it before I heard it. I was standing on a deck plate, and it came up through my boots and into my shins, and then my ears caught up with it. It went for maybe 3 seconds. Then it stopped, and there was only the rain and the sodium hum. I looked down the train with the hand held. That light was good for 150 feet on a bad night. I walked the beam down the length of it, car by car, and I want to describe this correctly because it is the only thing I have got. Past about car 60, the light did not stop on anything. It also did not carry on. There was no far end of the beam. On a rainy night, you can see where a light gives out. There's a place where it goes soft and quits. There was no place. The beam went into that end of the yard, and there was nothing to report about it in either direction. I turned it off. Then I turned it back on, and it was ordinary, and I could see car 90 and the ramp beyond it. The last one was the rain. It had been coming down sideways all night, hard enough to hurt your face on the north side of a car. And for a period I will call a minute and a half, it came straight down. Vertical. Every drop of it, no angle at all, in an open yard with nothing to break the wind, and then it went back to sideways. There were 2 soldiers asleep sitting up in the cab of a wrecker. I went and banged on the glass at about 20 to 4, because at that point I wanted another person awake in the world, and they did not wake. Both of them upright, chins down, and I put the flashlight on their faces and hammered the door with the flat of my hand, and neither one of them moved. They woke on their own around 10 past 4, and got out and asked me what I needed, and they were completely fine and had no idea. I did not tell them what I needed. At about 5, the night shift lead came through, and I told him about the 40 and got ready to take what was coming. And he said a rest cycle crew from another battalion had been pushed to the yard as augmentation and had finished my section. That is a completely ordinary thing to happen on a surge. It happens constantly. Somebody's people get shoved somewhere they were not scheduled and nobody tells anybody. I believed him entirely. I had to sit down on a ramp for a minute. That is how relieved I was, and I remember the cold coming up through my trousers and not caring at all. First light, I walked to the 40 with the load plan, expecting to find them chained wrong. That is what you expect from a crew that did not brief with you and did not know the load. Wrong attachment points, wrong angles, chains crossed. Every vehicle was chained. 4 chains, correct attachment points, correct angles. Nothing crossed, nothing fouled, and every binder was set to the same tension. I checked them with my hand, car after car, 40 vehicles, 160 binders, and they were identical. I want you to understand that is not possible with a crew. It is not possible with one person. Tension varies by chain length and by how tired the arm is and by which hand you are using. And it varies for me, and I was good, and every hook was turned the same direction. That is not a requirement. There is nothing in any manual about which way a grab hook faces. It is not a habit. No crew on Earth does it because there is no reason to. I had one clear thought standing at car 61, and the thought was 40 hours. I had been awake 40 hours and I had probably chained these myself and lost the memory of it, which does happen. People do things at that level of tired and cannot retrieve them afterward. I actually liked that idea for about a minute. Then I worked out that 40 vehicles is a little over 4 hours of work for a rested 4-person crew, and I had been standing in one place with a clipboard for most of the window, and Tillery had been on the radio with me twice inside it. There was no stamp on any of the chains, not worn off, not painted over. I went down 12 or 15 of them with my thumb, and then I got my gloves off and did it barehanded in that weather, and there was no place on the link where a stamp had ever been, smooth steel where a maker's mark goes. And then I counted the bins. and that is where I stopped. The chain bins on the ramp were empty, stacked, 4 high, and swept out, and there had not been enough chain in that yard for 40 vehicles. That was one of the reasons I sent the crews to rest. I was 200 and some change short, and the next issue was not until 8 in the morning. I had written it on the clipboard in my hand. The ramp had held 6 inches of standing ice water all night. Under where those bins were stacked, the concrete was dry. A dry rectangle exactly the size of the stack, with water all the way around it. I spent about 2 weeks checking on the augmentation crew, quietly, in the way you check on something when you cannot say why you are asking. There was no crew. Nothing was pushed to that yard that night from anywhere. The shift lead had heard it from somebody and could not remember who, and by the time I got to him about it, he was irritated with me. And then he was gone, and so was I, and so was everybody. The train left on time. The load rode fine. Nobody was hurt, and nothing shifted, and as far as any record anywhere shows, that was a good night at a railhead. I run my hand down a chain looking for the stamp. On a trailer at a gas station. On a load in front of me on the interstate. If traffic gives me the chance to get alongside. On a swing set I bought my grandson, which does not have chains that are stamped and which I checked anyway, twice before I would let him on it. It is a good habit, that is what I tell myself. It is a genuinely good habit, and I would have taught it to anybody. Somebody cleaned 40 sets of tack in my tack room and did not use my soap. I do not much care whether you believe that. It happened, and I have got a stable to run, and I have never told it to more than about 6 people in 27 years. Coralie Nunnally. I ran the post-riding stables at Fort Campbell for 19 years, and in November of 1998 I was 58 years old, and I had 22 head in there in a covered arena and a tack room, and I came back most nights for the last feed because I do not sleep well anyway and never have. People are always surprised there were stables. There were. Morale and recreation ran them. Half a mile from the flight line as the crow flies, and every year somebody in an office decided we were going to be closed, and every year we were not. Writing lessons for kids on post, a therapeutic writing program on Saturdays, a few boarders. 22 head, 6 days a week, 19 years. I will give you a few of them because they are the reason I stayed. There was a big Plain Bay gelding named Sergeant Major who had come off a ceremonial detachment somewhere and who would stand for absolutely anything, and we put every frightened child in the county on him. There was Biscuit, a pony with the disposition of a wasp, who taught more kids to ride than the rest of the barn combined because you had to actually ride him. And there was a chestnut mare called June that nobody could catch in a paddock, not me, not anybody, not in 19 years, and who would walk up to the gate on her own the second you stopped trying. The other thing to know is the noise. Half a mile off is the flight line, and helicopters go over that place at all hours, and after a week you do not hear them. I want that established before I get any further. Normal at those stables was rain on tin and rotor noise and 22 head-banging buckets. It was never quiet there, not once in 19 years. I knew that tack the way you know your own kitchen. I could have put my hand on any bridle in that room in the dark and told you whose it was and what was wrong with it. 2 things about the tack room, and then I will get to it. The first is the pegs. Every bridle hangs on its own peg, figure-8'd. That means you take the reins and the throat latch and you wrap them around the whole business in a figure-8 and tuck the end through, so nothing hangs down. There are 2 reasons. One is that leather on a floor gets stepped on. The other is mice. A rein hanging down is a road, and I had been at war with the mice in that building since the Reagan administration. I taught the figure-8 to every volunteer and every child who came through there, and I was relentless about it, and I make no apology. The second is the soap. saddle, soap in a tin, and the tin is either wet on top or dry on top, and I always know which, because I am the last person to touch it every single night. It had rained for 3 weeks. I want you to have that. 3 solid weeks of a wet Tennessee November. Everything mud, the horses stall-bound and hateful. The arena the only dry footing on the place. And rain on that tin roof so loud that from October to March you communicate at the stables, mostly by pointing. I came in about 10 that night for last feed and water. The horses were all facing the same wall. 22 head, every one of them turned to the arena side of the stall, standing square, and not one of them eating. Now, horses will spook together. That is not remarkable. But a spooked horse moves. These were not moving. They were standing, and they were quiet, and every one of them was pointed the same way, at a wall with nothing behind it but the arena, and Biscuit, a pony we had, who was the loudest animal I have ever owned, did not make a sound the whole time I was in that barn. I went and got the feed cart, because when you do not know what to do, you do the next thing. I do the stalls in the same order every night, and have since about 1982, down the north side to the end and back up the south. And I did them in that order, and every horse I passed was still facing that wall, and I stopped looking at them after about the 6th one because I did not care for the feeling of walking down a row of animals that were all attending to something else. When I came out of the feed room, the arena was lit. Those were mercury vapor fixtures up in the roof, and they take about 4 minutes to strike, and they come up through a color you would know if you have ever stood under them. They were not coming up. They were at full. All of them. The switch is in the feed room. I had just walked out of the feed room. I went back in and looked at it, and it was down, and I put my hand on it, and it was off. I flipped it up, and the arena stayed lit, and I flipped it back down, and the arena stayed lit. I went and stood in the arena doorway. I will tell you what I saw, which is nothing, and I will tell you how the nothing went. The near end was the near end. The standards were where we had left them from the Saturday lesson. Past the second set of standards, the far end of that arena was not further away than usual, and it was not dark. It was lit, same as the rest. It was simply not somewhere I could put my eye. I would look at it and find that I had looked at the wall instead, or at the rail, or at my own hands. I did not go down there. I was 58 years old, and I'd been up since 4, and I had no interest. Then the rain stopped. Not tapered, stopped on that roof all at once, and after 3 weeks the silence in that building was the loudest thing I have ever stood in. It went on maybe 2 minutes. And I walked to the arena's east door and opened it and put my head out, and it was raining. Coming down hard, off the eave, splashing on my boots. Rain on the ground, and no rain on the roof. I shut the door and I finished the feed, because those horses were going to eat whether the world made sense or not. The cats were on the wash rack. 4 barn cats, and I have never in my life seen those 4 animals in the same place voluntarily. They were sitting in a row on the wash rack facing the tack room door, awake, upright, and they did not move for me. Cats move for you. I had to step over them, all 4, one at a time, and not one of them so much as flattened an ear. The tack room light was already on. Here is the part that I still find strange about myself. I stood in that doorway, and I was pleased, because it was clean. Every set. Bridles on their pegs, saddles on their racks, girths hung, the whole room smelling of oil and soap the way it smells about twice a year when somebody has really gone at it. And what I thought, instantly, with my whole heart, was that one of the Saturday volunteers had come in and done a tack cleaning as a surprise. They had done exactly that before. There was a retired warrant officer named Sturdivant who came every Saturday for 6 years, and who would absolutely have done that and not said a word about it. I stood in there planning what I was going to say to him. Then I picked up the soap tin. It was dry. Dry on top, the way I had left it. The sponges in the bucket were dry. There was no oil on the floor, and there is always oil on the floor. There was no rag in the rag bin, and no rag in the sink, and no rag anywhere in that room, and you cannot do one saddle without a rag, let alone 40. And I know what it takes, is the thing. You strip the bridle down to pieces. You wash the dirt off with a damp sponge first, because if you soap over grit, you are just sanding the leather. Then the soap, worked to a lather, and you get into the folds and the billet holes and behind the buckles. Then oil, sparing, and then you leave it to take the oil and you come back and buff it. 20 minutes if you are quick, and you are not quick when you are doing it properly. 40 sets. I want to be clear what that is. It is not a wipe down. That leather was worked. Some of those bridles had been stiff for years, school tack that gets used hard and oiled twice a season if I am honest, and they were supple. Soft. The kind of soft that comes from 20 minutes a set with your hands, and there were 40 of them. And that is 12 or 13 hours of work by somebody who knows exactly what they are doing. And then I saw the saddles. They were racked shortest to tallest. Nobody racks saddles by height, nobody. You rack them by whose they are, or by size for the rider, or by what is going out in the morning, because a tack room is a working room, and the arrangement has to answer a question you will have at 6 a.m. in the dark. Shortest to tallest answers, no question. It is an arrangement for looking at. It is a display. And every bridle was figure-eighted the other way round, all 40. Correct, neat, tucked, on the right pegs, mirrored. I stood there a good while. I am not going to pretend I ran. I put the tin down where it goes, and I looked at that room the way you look at a photograph of your own house taken by a stranger. Everything correct, everything in its place, and the whole of it belonging to somebody else. I turned the light off and I shut the door and I went home. The horses were eating when I left. The cats had gone wherever cats go. The rain was back on the roof and it stayed for another 4 days. In the morning, I asked the girl who opened up whether anybody had been by, and she said no, and I did not ask her anything else. I never asked Sturdivant. I saw him that Saturday and I looked at his hands, which is a foolish thing to do, and I did not ask him. I will not oil tack after dark. I set it out with a note and the morning girl does it. 27 years, 3 different barns, and I have not once cleaned a piece of leather after the sun went down. Nobody has ever asked me why. I would tell them. I would tell anybody who asked. It is only that nobody asks, and I am not going to bring it up in a tack room. The flour on that floor got swept into a square. I have thought about it a long time. 73 years, off and on, mostly when I am sweeping. It is not a frightening thing to me, and I want to say that at the start, because I am told some of these are frightening and mine is not. Mine is only a thing that happened. This was the spring of 1953 at Fort Campbell in the bakery. There was a bakery then. People do not know that. A post that size fed 40,000 men, and the bread came from a room with 4 deck ovens in it, and 2 proof boxes and a bench and a scale, and somebody had to be in that room all night, and the somebody was me, because I was the youngest man there, and that is how it works. I asked for it, is the thing. When they put me down for cook and asked did I have a preference, I said bakery, and the reason was my mother. She made biscuits every morning of her life, and I had stood at her elbow since I could see over the table. Robertson County. Little place north of Springfield, and there is not a thing to say about it except that it was mine. She used a bowl she never washed. You are not supposed to say that now, but that is what she did. The flour stayed in the bowl and she worked into it, and the bowl was maybe 40 years old by the time I was born, and I have got it. It is on a shelf about 8 feet from where I am sitting. I was homesick. I do not know if I have ever said that out loud. 18 years old, first time away, and a bakery at 2 in the morning smells like the one room in the world I wanted to be in. That is really the whole reason I liked that job, and it took me about 60 years to work that out. I liked being in there alone. It was warm, and it smelled good, and nobody bothered me. I have had a good many jobs since, and I never had a better one. Here is what the night was. You scale the dough, you cut it off the mass, and you put it on a balance, and you get it to weight. And there is a pleasure in getting it right on the first grab that I could not explain to you, and that has never gone away. Then you round it, and you bench it, and you let it rest, and then you pan it, and it proofs, and it bakes, and by 6 there are trays going out on carts, and men who will never think about you eating it. The troughs were on casters, and you pushed them where you wanted them, and they went where they liked. There was a peel with a handle worn down, smooth on one side. The scale was a balance with a brass pan and little weights in a wooden block, and I got so I could take hold of a piece of dough and know it before I set it down, and be right most of the time, and that is the closest thing to a talent I have ever had. And it was quiet out there. That is the thing about a post at night that nobody tells you. 40,000 men, and at 3 in the morning there is not one of them awake but the guard and the bakers and whoever is in trouble. You could hear a single truck go somewhere across the whole installation. There was a water tower you could see from the step, and I used to look at it, and I could not tell you why. And at the end, you sweep. The way I was taught is the way everybody is taught. You sweep the flour out from the middle to the walls, and then you go along the walls to the door, and you take it out the door. That is how you sweep a room. It is how my mother swept, and it is how the sergeant showed me, and it is how I would have told you it was done by every person who has ever held a broom. My name is Otis Lumpkin. I am 91. I should have said that earlier, and I forgot. The first thing was the proof box. You put the panned loaves in, and they rise, and how long that takes depends on the room and the day and how much yeast, and you learn it in your hands. I opened that box at about 2:30, and the dough had gone a great deal further than it had any business going in the time. Not ruined, just further. And it was warm in there in a way that box did not get. Because that box was not heated, it was only a box with a door on it that held the room's own warmth. I remember standing there with the door open, thinking I had lost track of the clock. That is all I thought. The second thing was the ovens. 4 deck ovens on that wall, and they had gauges on the front, and those needles never sat together. They came up one at a time as the burners cycled, and there was always one lagging, and it was always the third one. And everybody who worked that room knew the third one was slow. I looked up at some point, and all 4 needles were on the same number. Same place, all 4, and I stood and watched them for a while, and they stayed there. I did not do anything about it. There was nothing to do about it. 4 ovens at the right temperature is not a problem. It is a good night. I went outside for some air. It was a nice night. I want to put that in. I stood out on the step maybe 10 minutes, and it was cool and clear, and there were stars over the mess hall, and a long way off somebody was singing. One man, and I could not tell you the song, and I have tried. I did not see one thing. I want to be plain about that, because I know that is what a person listens for. I did not see anything. I was outside for 10 minutes on a nice night, and then I went back in. Every loaf was panned. Seam down. Evenly spaced in the pans squared on the racks squared to the wall. Work I had left half done, finished, and finished better than I could do it at 18 years old, because the spacing was even, and mine never was. And I said good morning out loud. That is the truth. I thought the day baker had come in early, which he did sometimes, a staff sergeant named Wilkes, and I said good morning into an empty room, and nobody answered. and I was not frightened, I was embarrassed. That is exactly what I was. Embarrassed, standing in a bakery at 3 a.m, saying good morning to nobody. Then I looked down. The flour on the floor had been swept into one pile in the middle of the room, and it was a square. It had corners on it, 4 corners, and the sides of it straight. About so big, sitting in the middle of that floor like something set down rather than something swept up. There were no broom marks around it. That is the part. When you sweep a floor, you can see where the broom went, always. The little arcs in the dust at the edges. There was none of that. The floor around that square was clean the way a floor is clean, not the way a swept floor is clean, and I do not know how else to say it. And there were no footprints in the flour. And the broom was out in the hall, leaning against the wall where I had left it. I panned the last 2 racks. I do not know why I want to tell you that, but I do. I finished the work. I baked the bread, and the bread was good, and Wilkes came in at 5 and said it was good, which he did about twice a year, and I did not tell him. I never told anybody at all until I was about 70. I might have had it wrong. I was 18. I have had 73 years to decide I had it wrong, and I have not been able to. Now, here's what I do. I sweep toward the middle of the room. I have done it my whole life. 3 houses and a shop I owned for 22 years in Springfield, a little bakery of my own, and I swept that floor every night for 22 years toward the middle. Never out to the walls. Never once. Dorothy used to laugh at me. My wife, she would stand in the door with a cup and laugh at me and say I was making more work, and she was right, because then you have to get down and pick it up. She died in 2019. She was 84. Nobody laughs at me now. I still do it. My hands are not good anymore. It takes me a while. I have got a little broom my granddaughter bought me with a short handle, and I go slow, and I do a bit, and then I sit down, and then I do a bit more. But I get it to the middle. I get it all the way to the middle, and I stand and look at it a minute, and then I get the pan and I pick it up. And then I go to bed,